Conditioning is all about increasing the shelf life of the grain and being able to store it longer and being able to sell it when you want to sell it. The principles are all about the moisture content and the temperature, because they are the two things that affect shelf life. As you increase in temperature, you lose shelf life. As you decrease in temperature, you gain shelf life. If you drop the moisture, you increase the shelf life. So if a 1% change in shelf life roughly doubles the amount of time you can store the grain. And the same thing goes with temperature, only it's not quite as much. It's a factor of about 1.8. The principles that affect the equilibrium moisture are temperature and humidity. The main principle is that equilibrium moisture is the temperature and humidity combination needed to keep or bring grain to a specific moisture. The principles that are involved is when the ambient air is wet, you can usually add a small amount of heat to bring it to the target EQM. And if the air is too dry, cooling would be required. The point being is that a small amount of heat can bring it to the desired moisture. The way equilibrium moisture works is that there is vapor pressure in the air that's pushing against the water vapor pressure that's in the kernel. When the vapor pressure in the air is greater than what's in the kernel, it pushes moisture into the kernel, and when the vapor pressure in the kernel is greater, it dries out the grain and pushes the water to the surface of the grain. The relative humidity and temperature is what dictates how much vapor pressure there is in the air, and the temperature of the grain and the moisture content is what dictates what vapor pressure there is from the kernel. This is a graph of Sioux Falls weather data and what would happen with a fan running under the conditions that existed during harvest time in 2018. The thing that you can see here is in red, this is the temperature going up and down over the course of a day. And you can see each day in the afternoon it gets warmer, and in the evening it gets colder. And during those same time periods when it's getting colder, the humidity goes up, and the same thing happens with the equilibrium moisture. It gets where it's too dry during the day, because your target moisture here is sitting at 14.8, and here if you ran the fans you would be actually over drying the grain. And during this time period you're too wet, and the only time that is right is when you're in the zone where the fan can run full speed and you're on either side of target fairly close. So the point here is that if you add a heater to this, you now take those time periods where you were above the equilibrium moisture, and it lays the equilibrium moisture right on there by just adding a few degrees of heat to it. So you can see that the amount of time period that you actually are doing drying went here. It shows that it's 43% that you are actually doing drying. And if you go to without a heater, there's only 14% of the time that you are actually in the zone where you're able to do drying. And that's the beauty of how the system works. So the first thing you do is you go to settings, and you can see the EQMT 04 is there. So we select that, and then I type in VFD AUTOMTION, join. Okay, so now it's joining that, and now you can see that it's connected to it. And now we need to go to the browser, which would be Safari in this case. And you go to the 192.168.8.1 and it brings you right to it. Okay, that brings us to there. And we hit this little square, and we hit add to home screen. There we go. Add. And now we have an icon on there for EQMT control. So if we select that, it brings us to the dashboard. This is the dashboard that you would normally come to when you first install the unit. You would tell it your company name, the site name, which bin it's on, what grain you have, how many rings of grain you have in your bin, and temperature and relative humidity sensors. You tell it which type it has and whether or not it has a heater or has a VFD. You can edit this information and put in any of the data that's required. So it's relatively straightforward. It just asks you for the information. You can put in limits of, I don't want the thing running when it's below freezing much. I don't want it running when it's 90 degrees outside. I don't want it running when there's, it's raining. And I don't want it running when it's super dry. So you can put those things in there. If you have a VFD, you can tell it, I don't want the fan to slow down any less than 400 RPM, or whatever you want to set that at. The sensors are right now we use just the Dwyer temperature relative humidity sensor. As far as the valve opening for lighting the valve, we don't have to be adjusting valve linkages or anything. We just put in, we can do it from here and put it on voltages. That's all there is to what you have to tell it so it knows where to go. And then you select run, and it brings you to this gauge, a series of gauges here, which tells you what the temperature and humidity is of the incoming air that's going into it, the temperature and humidity that's going into the headspace of the bin. It'll also tell you what your fan RPM is. Now in this particular case it's a simulation and the fan speed is coming up. And this is the screen that you would normally see when you're near the unit. And then, again, this can be used with a pad. It can be used with your phone. And it's relatively simple how you connect to it. So in this particular case, the heat is off. We've got an equilibrium target of 14.8. We're actually at 15. If we get much wetter, the heater will turn on. So I'll adjust that here a second. So now we're at 15.4 for our moisture of the air that's coming in, and we have just turned on the heat, and the valve is opening up, trying to get the temperature correct. We also, if we have an additional sensor, we can monitor the temperature and relative humidity in the headspace of the bin so that you know what potential condensation or anything that's going on up in there. And we also monitor that to know when the temperature and relative humidity of what's going in is equal to what's going out. You know that your drying is complete. When you have data in your unit, you can go back and look at your records, and you can actually select which time period you want. You can select the number of days that you want the data for, and it will show what the unit did. When you are looking at your records, You can select the download button to transfer the information over the time period that you've selected to your mobile device, which you can take home, transfer that file to your regular computer if you wanted to have a hard copy, or to keep records for in another place. The unit itself is capable of several years of data storage.